Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to a very special episode of the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, as the title suggests, I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about production stories, marketing stories, release stories, distribution stories, all those ingredients, really, that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. Try not to do snark, try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and an appreciation of just how difficult it is to get a movie made. Now, what you've happened upon here is one of my special episodes of Film Stories, when I bring in a filmmaking guest to talk about their latest work or their body of work, and we get a bit of both in this particular case. So I've been trying to get the filmmaker Aline Brosh McKenna onto this podcast for a little while. She's long been on my list of people I really want to talk to. Courtesy primarily, actually, originally of a couple of films she wrote that I really like that not many people talk about. One of those is Morning Glory, directed by Roger Michell, starring the brilliant Rachel McAdams, Diane Keaton and Harrison Ford. And the other is We Bought a Zoo, that she penned the screenplay for, was directed by Cameron Crowe. And two really charming films that I'm a big fan of. We are going to be talking about those. Now, most people really associate Aline Brosh McKenna, and she's a writer, a director, a producer. She's all sorts. She does tons of stuff with a couple of projects. That perhaps the highest profile is The Devil Wears Prada, that was directed by David Frankel, that she wrote the script for. And then she created, along with Rachel Bloom, and the Rachel you'll hear mentioned in this interview is Rachel Bloom, the hugely popular television series Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. What we're ostensibly here to talk about, though, is a feature directorial debut, Your Place or Mine, which landed on Netflix a week or two ago as this is being recorded. It stars Reese Witherspoon, who also produces, opposite Ashton Kutcher as well. And Aline Brosh McKenna writes, produces and directs that film. We're also we name check a couple of other things in here. So just to give you just a quick list of things just to put in your head before you listen to the conversation. The film Whiplash comes up, for instance, which I've covered before on this podcast. I've covered Morning Glory before on this podcast as well. Written and directed by Damien Chazelle, that one. 1959's Pillow Talk is loosely referenced when we end up talking about Doris Day and Rock Hudson. It will all make sense once you listen to this. Jennifer Lee, whose name I bring up at one point, is the writer and director of Disney's Frozen, co-director of Disney's Frozen, and she now heads up Walt Disney Animation Studios. And I also bring into the story the brilliant Nancy Myers, the director of films such as The Parent Trap, Something's Gotta Give, The Holiday, The Intern. And so her name crops up in the conversation as well. But I think that's all you need to know going in, he says, after reading a bit of a list. As always, I'm going to set the conversation up with a clip from the trailer of the film we're talking about, in this case, Your Place or Mine, which is available on Netflix now. And then the other side of that, you'll hear my conversation with the brilliant Aline Brosh McKenna.
Hey, Debbie.
Happy birthday, Peter. 20 years of friendship. Can you believe it?
How do you still speak to me?
Do you remember the first night we met?
Never stops being weird.
So weird.
Debbie, you need to take a break.
I just need to be practical, which is what you have to be when you're a single mom. Right. Tragic.
I got an idea. I'm coming to LA for a week. I'm going to look after Jack, and you can stay here.
I don't know.
You need help. Let me help.
Taking care of Jack is a lot of work.
I think I got this.
I hope that you get what you want out of this trip. Find yourself a hottie. Maybe get waxed.
Waxed? Oh, waxed.
Waxed.
Oh, well, that's just not going to happen. This place?
So that was a clip from Your Place or Mine, the feature directorial debut, not the directorial debut of writer, producer, comic book writer, everything really, from what I presume you head up the PTI, I know. Aline Brosh McKenna, thank you very much for joining me.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here, Simon.
So we're recording this. It's nearly 2 weeks after the release of Your Place or Mine, and I love doing interviews at this bit because, like, in the 3 days before, it just always looks like a whirlwind. And I'm just wondering what the 2 weeks after is. Appreciating you've got, I read 15 other things on the go, and that's not an exaggeration, as I understand it. But what's this bit?
That's such a good, interesting question. You carry this thing around with you. It's your special little baby unicorn, but you make it so that other people can watch it. You don't really, I mean, I can only speak for myself, but I don't really make it just for myself. I'm making it for people to enjoy and bring into their lives. And so, on the one hand, it felt very joyful and exhilarating. And then on the other hand, it felt like someone had stripped me and pushed me out the door, the front door. It's a very weirdly exciting, but nakedy feeling. And you never really can know what things people will respond to and not, and, sort of seeing how people react. And also my first movie came out in 2000. Yeah, 2000. And so in those years, it was like you'd get a few reviews and you'd go to the movie theater and see how people were enjoying it. And now the amount of feedback is just kind of overwhelming, with social media and, all of the press. And there's so much more of it than there used to be. So metabolizing that change, that shift as I've gotten, deeper into my career has been really interesting.
Because the missing ingredient, I mean, you've seen this more than most, I think, the missing ingredient in a film's release, and I talk to a lot of first-time directors who are just wrestling with this, to my eyes, is just time. That 10, 15 years for time to do its work with a film. And you've seen this.
In terms of what the movie is?
Yeah, in terms of getting, because as you say, the current release schedule is everything has to be a massive blast. But then
you're getting feedback and input and tweets and you could sort of gorge yourself on it or not. And I think you have to find, but in the past, you just would have, it was in the moment, it was so much smaller, the amount you could consume. But you bring up something really interesting, which is I don't think you really know how a movie has landed really until some time has gone by and you kind of see what place it occupies in the culture. For instance, We Bought a Zoo is become sort of a meme, and my kids find it incredibly funny because somehow people found that title funny, or the idea of that movie funny, or the something about, and obviously not everybody, because it's a very sincere, sweet movie that a lot of people love. But is also this sort of memification of that movie. As so fascinating. You just don't ever know. It's like you hit this tennis ball and you never know what you're going to get back.
I remember that film just dripping into the UK. I mean, it was just one of the shyest releases, and it's a lovely film. I'm really glad you brought that up. I love We Bought a Zoo. The other example, the obvious example you're asked about a lot, presumably, is because when I told people I'm talking to you, it's just like, you've got to ask her about Devil Wears Prada. And I just kind of figure everyone asks you about Devil Wears Prada, but just acknowledging that what's that, 15 years on, presumably that's become like just as active in front of you now.
Yeah, it has its own life. I in an interview recently, I said that, Andy and Nate are definitely not together anymore. And that made news. And,
that's it. Yeah.
But what's interesting about that movie is also to see what things stuck with people. And I also, that the afterlife of a movie also depends very much on technologically where you land. And it just so happens that Devil Wears Prada and 27 Dresses are on television all the time. And that has to do with the aftermarket deals really that Fox made. So they're on all the time. Morning Glory, for whatever reason, doesn't have that kind of depth of distribution. It's not on TV as much. In fact, it wasn't on TV for a while. And it's not on, I don't know what streamer it's on right now, but
it's on Paramount Plus.
Is it really? It's on Paramount.
Over here, it's on Paramount Plus. Yeah.
Oh, good. Yeah. But that's one that that has had a different life, in that people will come up to me and they know that they're praising a special little baby of mine that didn't didn't become a phenomenon like a couple of my other movies have, or become a cultural document in the same way. Morning Glory is more a thing where people feel like, well, that's a movie I love. I don't even know if other people have heard of it. So
Yeah.
that's a funny, and I just got a message from a director who said, I watch that movie once a year.
Yeah, same.
So that's a little bit more of a specialty item. And it's really interesting how these things, they have a life of their own. They just have a life of their own. And it's like a child. You have to accept that it has a life of its own.
I think I see when I watch Morning Glory, which I adore, I just think you're the only person I think who watched Working Girl and thought, why can't Harrison Ford do more things like that?
Oh, he's so blissfully funny. Are you watching Shrinking on Apple?
I'm not. No, is he back doing that? Oh, I might do then.
So delightfully funny and a little less grumpy, but so funny. He has incredible timing. He's very generous with actors, and no, I love that. Man, I've been so lucky with these casts. They just have been incredible. And of course, Morning Glory is Roger Michelle.
Yes.
Who passed away a couple of years ago, and just was such a dear, such a love, and so talented, and left behind so many movies that are so wonderful.
I've listened to you on podcasts quite a lot, so I understand you've talked about this as well. But I just want to quickly touch on it. I mean, Hollywood, of course, likes to box people in. Mm-hmm. And I've read lots of interviews you've been doing in the release for this film, and it feels like we've got Aline Brosh McKenna. Let's just talk about rom-coms. Right. And I love rom-coms. So there's no snobbery at all from me on this. But it's just like I was right. I just did a little experiment after I watched Your Place or Mine, and I was just like, well, that's a film that's about distance, expectation, romance, the optimum age to show someone James Cameron's Aliens, and a world which is a great question, I think, but a world where also people aren't horrible by default. And I don't know, you the filmmaker, are you going in with a genre in mind, or I just get the sense that you're finding your story?
Yeah, gosh, Simon, that makes me feel very seen. I think of it from the point of view of characters, and that's where I always start. And I always start with a concept for the situation a character is in. So Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, 27 Dresses, Morning Glory, Your Place or Mine, they're all to me predicaments. And someone that I spoke to said that said you write coming of age movies for adults.
Yeah, I read that.
That really resonated with me because, you come of age, sometimes it's through work, sometimes it's through fighting with Harrison Ford or Meryl Streep, and sometimes it's through a love relationship. And sometimes it's through buying a zoo, and sometimes it's through. So I don't think of it. So the genre things to me are there as a guardrail or as a guide in a funny way. But it's funny, I have been quite resistant to writing things where people run into each other, where it's really a conventional rom-com. My first two movies were sort of, definitely written in that. And then 27 Dresses, I struggled with a lot to figure out how to have her end up getting married when she was obviously so far backwards still in her personal development. And the producer and I argued about it all the time, because my point was, at the place Jane is at the end of the movie, she needs a little time for self-discovery. But of course, the genre dictated that she ended up with Jimmy's character. And so that was an interesting kind of conundrum I had, which is like, is that character really ready for a big wedding with 27 bridesmaids? I'm not sure. And in a funny way, Crazy Ex was a spiritual cousin to that movie, where she didn't really, her ending was not as focused on romance. But I did know, here's the thing, when we were working on Crazy Ex, Rachel and I are both quite happily married. And we kind of remarked all the time about how we were writing this almost dystopian, through the looking glass deconstruction of romantic comedies, and then very happily going home to our spouses. So really, Your Place or Mine was, I wanted to write a movie where people fall in love and you feel like they deserve it. And it isn't, the obstacles are not exterior, they're interior. So, obviously there's a little bit of circumstantial stuff that happens that gets them apart. But once they're apart, it's just that in a way, she doesn't feel she deserves him, and in a way, he feels like he doesn't deserve her. And then this idea that they have been telling stories to themselves, which are very limiting, which I think we all do, even if it's just like, oh, I could never wear that pair of pants. And it's like, maybe you could wear that pair of pants. Maybe you could wear that jacket. Maybe you could try the squid ink pasta, you know? And I wanted to write about how kind of calcified our ideas about ourselves can become, and what you have to overcome to be open to someone else. And that, for me, is what it's about. And it happens to be a romantic relationship. But for me, it could have been another type of relationship, because it is actually, in a funny way, quite similar to what happens in Morning Glory, which is that Harrison needs to learn to get over himself and cook an egg, you know, and she needs to accept that this diminished circumstance is a great circumstance for her. So, you know, it's interesting you say that, because I think once you're dealing with love and romance and those issues, you get ushered over to a certain corner of the room, which I'm happy to be in, because I love a lot of those movies. But I think there's an assumption that somehow the love narrative is less intellectual or less worthy. You know, I don't know why, because I'm assuming it's, you know, it seems to be as important to men as it is to women. But there's an interesting, I don't know. It's sometimes the reaction to these things are quite gendered. So it'll be like, it's cute, it's adorable, and I wonder if you're a man and you're writing action movies, do people say, it's very macho, your movie, it's so manly, your movie, you know, do we have a similar gendered response to what we think of as male genres as we do to what we think of as female genres?
I didn't know you were going to bring this up, but I wrote something down ahead of talking to you. So I went to, I mean, I'm a nobody, but I managed to bag into an early preview of the film Home Again. And of course, that's directed by Hayley Myers-Shire, but her mother came along to introduce the film. So there's Nancy Myers, who walks to the front of completely owns the room. You're just sat there. It's Nancy Myers' room.
Oh,
you know where you sit, and I'm quite
legend.
happy.
Yeah.
And so she takes the microphone and she just says, "Are there any men here?" I was just like, "Okay, right." And then she said, "Men, do any of you like my films?" And we're just like, "Well, yeah, of course we like your films." And then she's just like, "That's interesting. Studio executives tell me men don't like the films." Then just introduced her daughter. That was it. I just thought that was.
But let me ask you, Simon, do you think Devil Wears Prada is a romantic comedy?
Oh God, no! It's terrifying. But I've worked in magazines. You know, it's a horror film.
I agree with you.
It's a horror film.
It's a monster movie. It's a monster movie. And the cousin of that movie is Whiplash.
Yeah, see, I see that.
That's the most fabulous double feature you could ever do, because it's about power, authority, coming of age, finding yourself with this person that you're bouncing off of, to whom you don't really matter. And so, but it's the tone and the subject matter gets you into this rom-com thing. So listen, I'm assuming that anybody who gets grouped into a thing kind of squiggles in that box a little bit. And ultimately, I'm happy to embrace it. And for sure, Ashton and Reese are really happy to embrace it. But I just don't want the genre to be something that gets minimized or limited in a gendered way.
Absolutely. And I mean going to Morning Glory, the person who got me looking at that a little bit differently was I was lucky enough to have a conversation with Jennifer Lee before she took over the world and deservedly became overlord of everything. And I think she'd just written Wreck-It Ralph and hadn't quite got to Frozen. I presume she'd written it at that point, but she explained power dynamics on a scene by scene basis. And so, and then the first film I rewatched after that was Morning Glory, and just seeing the nuance. And again, I'm an outsider. I'm a movie watcher. I'm not a screenwriter. I'm not going to make a film, so I can just sit on my side of the fence. But I just remember watching it and just thinking, oh shit, yeah, I get that. Yeah, how it subtly shifts.
About a movie that comes out in the culture like Frozen, and has as much of an impact today as it did the day it came out, there's something about that. Talk about having an afterlife. There is something about that movie that if you show it to a 3-year-old, they will need to watch it on a loop for the next 2 years and dress the same as the characters in the movie. It's so profoundly compelling. And I think, why are some stories, I think some people are Odyssey people and some people are Iliad people. I think there's just different types of stories, because often I'll find, like, I'll turn something on and I'll think, this is well done. This is just not for me. It's just not a story that unlocks my lizard brain. Yeah. And why certain stories speak to certain people, and why we turn something on and immediately go, oh, this speaks to me, is, these are mysterious things that as a filmmaker, all you can really do is, I'm very like with Your Place Around, I was very interested in like what makes a friendship and what makes a romantic relationship. And I'm very interested when people say, oh, my spouse is my best friend. I've never connected to that, because to me, best friend has platonic overtones.
Yeah.
My best friend is my friend Kate, and we go to Costco together, and that's a different thing from a spouse. And I wanted to show sort of what are the moments of transformation that makes them go from friends into this romantic relationship. And I was really tickled by just the idea of getting into someone else's bed.
That's the bit that I'll clip and just put out as clickbait. You know how the world works.
Really? Oh,
yeah, that's it now. Everything's reduced to one sentence if we're not careful, isn't it? The thing with this as well, though, is I mean, you've got a really stylish opening credit on the film. I like how you very subtly morph from producer to writer to director. Very, very classy. I like that an awful lot. But when you know you're going to direct, and when you've directed before, and when you've overseen TV show before, does it change what you put on a piece of paper? This is my dim question, but I'm really interested in it, because there are moments when you've talked in the past about how the closest relationship you had with the director was on David Frankel on Devil Wears Prada, and he kept you close. But that's not usually the norm, to my understanding. But here you're doing splits. I mean, you're doing split screens. You're scrolling all over the screen. You look like you're having an absolute ball. And I'm just curious, what's on the piece of paper that's different when you know that you're the person who's got to sign it off at the very end?
That's such a good question. I mean, the closest directors that I was the closest to in the making of the movie were Frankel and Fletcher on 27 Dresses, who I was in close touch with, and Roger Michelle, where I was on the movie most of the time, actually on set most of the time. So those were the three, and I got to learn so much from them and their process. They're all three just tremendously kind people. And I actually worked with Anne on a movie. I did a little week of a rewrite on a movie with Anne, and she said something that a story I've been telling for however many years since that movie came out. But Anne and I walked into the production office, and a bunch of people ran over to her and asked her 8 different questions, and she went, the red one, Friday, James. Wow, she answered a bunch of questions, and then the people walked away, and she looks at me and she goes, well, I hope some of that works out. And when you're the writer and someone else is directing, you're really more in this space of suggesting, collaborating. You'll have moments of mind meld, and you'll have moments of not mind meld. Like in Prada, when Annie comes in after her makeover, David shoots it in slow motion. And I felt that was male gazy.
Right.
And and so we had a moment where I was like, I feel like that is something where we're pulling out of her point of view into someone seeing her and her beauty, appreciating her beauty in a third person way. And we talked about it, but his movie, he wins. And so on this, I got to do things that were really enjoyable. Just as you said, just to technically play with things, and this idea of closeness, sameness, and the sort of the Doris Day, Rock Hudson, merging characters in a frame, but in an updated fashion. So I was lucky enough to work with Florian Ballhaus, who was also the DP on Prada, who I've known for the 16 years since then and stalked basically. And I was so lucky that he was available when I wanted to make this movie. And actually, he was at the end of a very long run of work and was quite tired, but did it, for me, which I will be endlessly grateful for. That credit sequence is, when I watch it, it seems delightfully effortless. It is the most bespoke. We storyboarded it with this very famous storyboard artist named Warren Drummond. We storyboarded every minute of it. And it was we called it the perpendicular montage, because someone is always going this way and someone is going this way. And so those frames are designed so that somebody moves through the frame this way and then the other character comes in this way. So that's why we called it the perpendicular montage. And that's all very, very, very written out and scripted and tremendously fun. All those split screens were tremendously fun, and then also tremendously technologically challenging, and sort of on set figuring out the timing, using, literally timing how long it takes for them to walk in and sit down, and such fun, and such a contrast to sitting in your office by yourself and thumb twiddling, and it's so solitary being a writer, and it's so delightfully social being on a set and collaborating with these people.
I see. I'm proving how movie heathen I am, because the Doris Day and Rock Hudson things only just occurred to me, because that was all about decency, wasn't it? At the time, they weren't allowed to be in the same scene. I think that's my vague recollection of that.
Maybe, and that had such a kind of wonderfully arch candy box. Peyton Reed did a very good homage to it in Down to Love.
Yeah.
Down by Love.
The Ewan McGregor, Reese Witherspoon.
Yes.
It's a lovely film.
Renee Zellweger.
That's it. Sorry.
I wanted to do a more organic version of that, where, like, the bathtub that Ashton is her bathroom. It's tiny. It's got books everywhere. It's got products everywhere, and she's in the pristine tub. So I was trying to contrast them as much as I could. And one other thing about doing split screens is you get both performances all the way through. So ordinarily you'll get this person's face, and then this person's face, and then this person's face, and then this person's face. And occasionally you'll get this, right? And occasionally you'll get this. But in split screen, they're both here full frame, so you can see the whole performance, the listening as well as the speaking. And that delighted me. So for example, when she first comes to Brooklyn, her shot is a complete oneer.
Yeah.
And then his scene is cut to match hers, but she's in a oneer. There are a lot of long oneers in the movie, but this one, you can see her perform all the way through. And the one where they're on the phone and she's at the sink and he's at the table, there are very few cuts in there, but also you can see both of them all the way through. And that, when you have performers like we had, that made it delightful.
Can I ask the bit that I don't think you're being asked an awful lot about as well, which is the third hat that you wear on this film as well? Because the producer element is as crucial to guarding what you were trying to do there as much as anything else. I mean, me on the outside, if I was a producer and I saw a writer come in with a split screen thing, I just thought, well, that doubled the amount of work I've got to do, hasn't it?
Right, that's right.
So what's the producer element on something like this?
Well, I've got, because I made a relatively inexpensive television show with a lot of musical numbers that were quite technical. These were my musical numbers. We did what we had done with musical numbers, which was, we storyboarded them, we planned them very carefully. So I'd already kind of done that with the musical things, but I'm very good at cutting for money. And maybe I shouldn't tell people that, but towards the beginning of the movie, we had to cut some dollars out of the budget. And I just was so used to, in Crazy X, making a lot out of a little, partly because we had a genius line producer who really helped us do that. So I have a lot of instincts about how to do things cheaply, and sometimes had to be encouraged to kind of think outside of that box and take advantage of scale, and put a camera up in the corner on a balcony and get that extra shot. And, so as a producer managing myself as a director, sometimes I was saying, like, do the extra shot, do the extra setup. It's okay. You have time.
I read that you test screened this as well, that you were able to get that in. And again, I'm just fascinated by the person going in, because ordinarily, if you put a writer, a producer, and a director in a test screening, they're going to come out, I would have thought, with three completely different things. And I'm just wondering about the dynamic with you, really, when you're sat watching it, when it's been that close to you. You said right at the start that this is like something that you brought into being. And
yes. So I had two amazing producers on this movie. Michael Costigan, who was with me on day one, who I've known for 20 some years, who was at my elbow just, the whole time. And then Lauren Neustatter, who works with Reese, who came on with Reese. And Reese is a producer as well.
Yes, go.
But day to day on set, Lauren and Michael were there. So I always had that extra set of eyes. Heather Morris, who works at my company, who had also, was there through the whole process. And then really the people at Netflix are extremely smart and very helpful. And my executives were really helpful. So you have other people to bounce things off of. What's great about a test screening is somebody says, well, I don't think this is going to be funny. And a couple times I would say, well, let's wait and see what the test audience thinks and what they're picking up on and what they're understanding. And, you're relying at that point on the wisdom of crowds. And I love that. And then we did 2 screenings. We did a premiere in
amazing.
LA. And so seeing it with an audience, it was really just tremendously thrilling because, with a comedy and the audience also responded to all of the twists and the surprises, and they, gasped and they applauded. And so that was really interesting. But I do think most people have seen my movies at home. And so I think, especially things that didn't work well at the bottom, I would say probably 90% of the people who've seen Morning Glory saw it in their house, whether it was on a DVD or, So I don't stigmatize that, but seeing it with an audience gives you so much better of a sense of how people are responding to things. And sometimes simply just what they're in. For example, I'll give you an example. A very small number of people thought that Peter was Jack's father.
Interesting.
And had never occurred to me.
Interesting.
So there's a teeny phrase looped into the beginning where he says, he's not my kid, but just in case, I just didn't want that small percentage of people to think, oh my God, this asshole has a kid that he hasn't seen in all these years.
Yeah, I got it the wrong way round. I saw Prada on DVD and I saw Morning Glory and We Bought a Zoo in a cinema. So I am the worst test audience for everything, I think, on stuff like this. You've one of the things that I've seen throughout, I really love that you do this, and I hear it in lots of interviews, is you seem to go out of your way to name check your collaborators and name check the person, lower down the credits, if you like, just the kind of people who otherwise might be invisible to people like me. And I did want to ask you this, but I also with that inflection on it, because you've talked too about what you took from the directors you've worked with before. But what do you hope your collaborators take from you?
My hope always is that they have the most open environment for their expertise.
Yeah.
So I love experts. 99% of the people on a film set are experts in what they do, whether it's running cable, hanging lights, holding a boom, being an AD, like they're experts. And what I like to do is try and clear the deck so that they can bring to me into the film their expertise, because sometimes I'll say, oh, it should be this. I try and scan for the little micro expressions which say I have a better idea, and try and draw that idea out of them. Doesn't mean I will always take that idea, but I really like to hear what people's opinions and thoughts are so that I can kind of, from the perspective of their expertise.
Yeah.
And so I just love, and it's not just the department heads, it's all the way down. If you can, I shouldn't say down, across, if you can find someone who is willing to share their insights about, this would be a little better, or have you considered this? Or, and people have their expertise. So when I meet people to work on stuff, I try and find people who, might feel comfortable, speaking up. And I also try and find people who are comfortable going, what?
Yeah.
Because just the simple act of going, what? I don't understand you, is going to prevent a lot of misunderstandings or things where you go on set and you have a different idea. So really it's like trying to open the channels of communication as much as possible so that people can contribute the wisdom that they've spent years and years and years accumulating.
There's a story of Groundhog Day, and I can't remember the exact moment, but I do remember this bit of it. Of there was a problem with the film, and it was a junior member of the crew, and she just stuck her hand up, as I remember it, and just said, "No, that wouldn't happen," like really nervously and stuff like that.
Right.
And they listened to her, and it improved the movie. And the
Yeah.
reason that story sticks out for me is I've not heard anything like that in 30 years since of covering movies. That feels
Oh, no, that happens all the time. Actually, Frankel had a story in Prada about there was a wardrobe change that he was mulling, and
yeah,
the costumer, it wasn't the head of the department, it was the costumer who said to him, "You must do this because otherwise it doesn't make sense.
yeah.
You must do this." And yeah, it's you want all these people around you to bring their best. And the way I always express it is I want people who are putting their pants on in the morning being like, I can't wait to get there. I'm really excited. And I know my contributions will be heard and listened to, but you can't take every idea, but you want that context. And I love that. And a lot of the actors in the movie are people that I've known. And so they can also bring that sense of like, maybe I could do this, or maybe I could try that.
It's why I think the smaller story, it's one of the reasons this podcast exists. I think the smaller stories matter, because I think if we're going to make film reachable for people and make it feel like it's for them, first of all, I think it's important. I love the fact that you tell the story of the story, your stories, but also these micro stories of the making of a film suddenly make it a bit more accessible. I just think it could be me.
Yeah.
With that in mind, you put out a tweet. I'm nearly out of time, but I did want to ask you this. You put out a tweet last week, and reachability is a huge thing for me, because I grew up somewhere where a career in film was just not an option. No one was making films around me or anything like that. And it was a picture of you in 1990, and your caption was, I know you know it, I'm just describing it just for audio purposes, but your caption was along the lines that at that point you thought you might be able to write. And then here you are, you've directed a feature film, you've created a much loved TV series, which ran and still is bringing you lots of love. You've written these films, you've done all of this work. How accessible was that path to you back then? Was that open to you? And then it's a very obvious, predictable question, but it's an important one to me. What's the message to those who are staring at that path now and thinking it's not for them?
I mean, for me, so I grew up in a suburb of New York, and so in a not and with relative amounts of privilege, but my parents were brought up in poverty essentially, and had especially my father had sort of gotten themselves to this place. And on the one hand, we're quite assimilated. My dad was quite successful at work. My mother speaks many languages. She's very charming, but they never felt really, it's just when you have immigrant parents where English is not their first language and you have different food, and they also weren't really very socially connected because of, I think, that isolation. My mom's friends were almost always French, and my dad was a scientist and worked really hard. And so I didn't have the sense of that possibility. My grandmother was someone who couldn't read or write. And so I wore her necklace when I graduated from Harvard. Harvard was the place where I started to see other people doing things that I felt like, oh, okay. Because college is a great kind of leveling. It is and it isn't, but it can be a very, you're living in the same crappy dorm and eating the same crappy pasta. And so you feel like, okay, there's a sort of leveling. And I always look to people who seemed to me like they were better knitted into the culture and the mores than I had been. But I'm grateful for the perspective, because I think, my mom is French, North African, and my dad was Israeli. And I think that gave me a window into the world. And listen, my dad wasn't in show business, but he went from being a, pretty modest guy growing up in a very, very tiny house, with his dad making tile and his mom washing bottles, to a pretty comfortable life in a different country. So that kind of we had a lot of get up and go in our family. My brother's a very successful hotelier, and there's just a lot of get up and go.
But what was the bit where you knew this was you? Where did you fall in love with stories? Because I presume that's at the very heart of.
Yeah, it was I and my son was like this too. I mean, from the ages of 9 to 13, I always had a book in my hand, was reading at the dinner table, reading before bed, and omnivorous, so Jane Eyre, but Archie comics, and it was just reading in all different, trashy Judith Krantz, Anne Rule, who's a crime writer, Little House on the Prairie, but also for whatever reason I read so much John Updike. I have no idea what I related to in like middle-aged men in Connecticut cheating on their wives, but John Updike, John Irving, I read all the John Irvings, I was reading, and it comes from books.
And is that the thing for the person who perhaps is listening to this, who's sat at home thinking, I've got no way in, this isn't for me? Is it, because I hear that a lot.
Yeah,
that reading is
a story. I've said this before. People are hungry, they're thirsty, they're desperate. If you can tell a story, in whatever form it is, people love it. It's transformative. All right, let's do one more question before I'm going to take off and try and make more stories.
Oh, well, first of all, it's obvious you can give me the exclusive about Morning Glory 2 anytime you like, because that's the one that I'm in for. Lean Machine, can I just ask about that? Because that's now clearly a crucial part of what you're doing going forward as well, that you've built up this accumulation of knowledge and work, and 15 differing projects with presumably a whole gamut of people involved. Can you just snapshot that for us?
So I called it Lean Machine because Aline is a challenging thing for people. So if the company's called Lean Machine, and then it's Aline Machine, and that helps people learn my name. But what I wanted to do was be the producer that I loved having, which is a producer who can break story. Right. So I used to work a lot with this producer named Bobby Newmeyer, and we would sit for 2 hours and talk about story. It was like being in a little writer's room. And I've done that with a lot of other producers too, but to find someone who really can help you crack the story and has the patience to sit there and say, what about this? What about that? We're very, very writer focused at this company. So what I'm trying to do is have writers create something that they're proud of. And to be honest, try and work on some of the projects that I've loved that you're not seeing as much right now. Different types of comedies, really, and dramas, with certain types of people, certain types of stories that maybe we're not seeing as much. And it's really just a process of shoving them through. And I enjoy working on my own things, but I really enjoy also being a doula for other people to help them bring their stories into the world.
And that brought to an end my conversation with Aline Brosh McKenna. She had to run off and make a whole lot more stories. Her film, Your Place or Mine, is available on Netflix. She wrote, produced, directed it, starring Reese Witherspoon and Ashton Kutcher. That is available worldwide now. And that brings me to the end of another episode of Film Stories. Thank you so much for listening. You can find more from Film Stories at filmstories.co.uk. You can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find Film Stories on Twitter at Film Stories as well. And you can find our magazines, our Blu-ray at store.filmstories.co.uk. And if you want to support the podcast, it's patreon.com/Simon Brew. I'm going to crack on with writing your regular episode of Film Stories now. Huge thanks to Aline Brosh McKenna for sparing so much extra time for the podcast. We overran by about 10 minutes thanks to her generosity. I really appreciate that. The main thing, as always, is you all take care, you all look after yourselves. I'll be back soon with another bunch of Film Stories. Until then, bye-bye.